Okay, a bunch of people are joining at this time. Hello. Thank you so much for being here. I was eating lunch, so I was off video. So I'm gonna go back on. Hello, Diana, are you all set?
I am. I'm ready to go.
Okay. I assume people will be jumping in and out of this since it is lunchtime, but I wanted to say thank you so much for being here. I'm super excited about this. My name is Alex Baca. I am the policy manager with Greater Washington. I'm looking through our attendees and I see a number of folks that I know, and it's great that you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. And to those of you who are either new to GGWash or we haven't yet met, I'm looking forward to continuing our conversation. We've done, a couple of book talks over GGWash's history. This is something that I would love to make a more routine practice. Some of you, I think, joined us for our Color of Law book discussion in November. This will be a little bit different. Diana is the author of Brave New Home, so she's here to talk to us, and then I'll ask her some questions and hopefully we can get some questions from you all. So as for format, she's going to talk a bit about her book, which if you received my email about it, you know that I am a huge fan of. And it's beautiful. I should have brought my copy, which is around here somewhere. It's great. It's super readable and sort of tackles some of the existing presumptions and potential futures for single family zoning and what our communities might look like going forward, which is very relevant to the work that we do at our organization. Diana is also a former GGWash board member. She was the editor of Next City, currently at the Arts and Business Council of Philadelphia. So she's a great person to talk about all this stuff, and I'm super excited to have her here. I think I've probably talked enough to hopefully fill up the bandwidth for some people jumping on. So Diana, I'm going to turn it over to you. You are, welcome to kick this off by either talking more about yourself and more about your book, and then diving into your presentation.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Alex, and thanks to all of you for joining us. I just want to give a special shout out to Alex because she was somebody who I did send some early drafts to and gave me a lot of really great feedback for the book. And I wish I had sent to her like part 2 of the book. I only got in that first part and then I was just scrambling to finish by deadline. So, but in any case, I really appreciate that. And I'm really happy to be here participating in this program with GGWash. It's an organization that I'm really fond of and enjoy learning more about what's going on in the DC area through that. So I am going to share my screen. Oops, it says host disabled participant screen sharing. But while
intended.
try it again. Nope, still.
Let's see, that should not have been the case. Hold on.
Oh wait, no, I'm not also.
Why are we having a second?
Everyone say hi to Ron Thompson, who also works for GGWash. We're on the organizational account. Ron's our policy officer, and I'm super glad he's able to join. Let's see. Okay, Diana, you are now the meeting.
All right, we can do this.
Cool.
Okay. Okay, cool. So as Alex mentioned, I wrote this book called Brave New Home, and it came out last October. And I thought I would sort of start off by talking a little bit about why I decided to write the book. And then I'll give a little bit of a discussion that sort of follows the same kind of format for the book. And I know you all are based in DC, but I live in Philly. I've been here for the past I think 13, 14 years or so. And so there may be a little bit of a Philly inflection to some of the slides that I share, since I've both been influenced in my thinking here and have also been thinking just locally, how do I apply this work? So just to kind of start off with why I decided to write the book. And the idea for the book really came about during the beginning of the Trump administration, sort of in the 2016-17 time period, when Philadelphia, like a lot of other cities around the country, was experiencing tremendous price appreciation in terms of its housing, and just really felt quite frustrated and concerned thinking about how we were going to deal with the affordability crisis in our cities. There were a number of different types of policies that were being trotted out, whether it was, mandatory inclusionary zoning or things like the Seattle head tax, if you remember that from a few years ago, to try to build more affordable housing. It just didn't seem like there was a ton of tools in our tool case, especially at a time when there wasn't much federal support for building affordable housing either. So that was one kernel, and I'll kind of talk about a bunch of different factors that led me to the thesis for the book. So the first one being just sort of how do we address affordability, particularly kind of from a market-driven side of things in cities. The second was segregation in our cities. Like this little screenshot from a Washington Post piece notes, our cities are more diverse than ever, and they're also more segregated. And I was really trying to grapple with why is that the case still? What are the factors that are encouraging people to move into neighborhoods where they're increasingly segregated? And a lot of that kind of led me to thinking about schools, property values, and all these other various different factors that also led me back to the issue of housing types and the sort of housing industry that we have created thus far. The third issue that I was sort of grappling with was just the increasing concern over mental health in this country, loneliness as one of those issues that has been gotten heightened concern recently, but more generally speaking, compared to even other developed democracies, the US has a lot of people who are struggling with mental health issues. And I was really trying to understand, what is it about our society that's causing that? And certainly there are a lot of different directions that you could point to for what's causing people to feel depressed or lonely. But one thing that I felt in sort of my own existence even was that a lot of it had to do with the kinds of housing that people were living in. And not just, looking at this from a frame of like, if you live alone, that you're lonely necessarily, but as I start the book out, I tell the story of having my first child and sort of for the first time experiencing something not unlike the kind of sort of quarantining that has happened over the past year of just sort of being at home a tremendous amount. And so that was another factor that I really wanted to explore was how does our housing increase people's sense of loneliness or their mental health? And then lastly, I was, climate change has certainly been an issue on people's minds for a long period of time, but in the past couple of years, just sort of seeing how climate change is affecting us, not in the future, but in the now. I was, really struck by issues like California wildfires, like coastal flooding, and thinking about, why is it that some of these communities are in the way of danger in the first place, just based on the locations of some of these occurrences, and really felt that in many cases it was related to people living in areas outside of core downtowns or sort of dense urban areas, and instead pushing further and further into nature, and how that was contributing to climate change. And then likewise thinking like, well, if we're going to address climate change in this country, how are we going to do that based on the sort of development patterns that we have here? So these are a bunch of these various different sort of big issues of what's going on in the country that I really wanted to address through a singular focus on the issue of single family homes. And really what I felt like at the time was that there had been a lot of discussion, long-standing discussion about all of the benefits of single family homes. You know, it's the cornerstone of the American dream to have, you know, that house with a white picket fence. But it's certainly also just at a very practical level seen for many people as the kind of gateway to wealth creation and stability in their lives. We have always assumed that sort of increased privacy and space are these kind of aspirations as part of our culture, and by comparison, very little discussion that has that was focused on sort of the comparative downsides of living this way, and not really, you know, much of a sort of look at how we might be able to address improving so many various different aspects of American life through this one particular issue. And so that's really what I aspire to do with the book, not only to look at the single family home as a from one dimension, but as something that has social, economic, and environmental implications. So the book is sort of divided into 3 sections. The first be a history of single family, really looking at kind of like, how did we get here? The second part is solutions. So new other ways of living that might actually help solve some of those problems that I kind of outlined at the beginning. And then lastly, sort of how do we get to the housing that we want? What might be some ways to address these various different issues? And so the remainder of my talk will kind of follow those that format. So I thought it was really important to start off the book and this conversation looking at what did housing look like? And I think there has always been this assumption that the single family home is the way that people have always lived in the US. An assumption probably not among the GGWash crowd, but in the US. And in fact, it's really not the way that Americans lived for, you know, for much of the country's history, and frankly, the way that people have lived throughout much of history, even before the US. And so this is a picture of a boarding house in Tacoma in the late 1800s. And in fact, this style of living was much more commonplace as a way of living throughout the 1800s. And you can see sort of how this, you might imagine this setup being 2 single family homes at this point, with maybe, you know, a family of 4 in each one of them. But back then, this housed about 30 people, I counted it once, within this boarding home. And while, you know, this is a sort of formalized style of boarding, having people as boarders or being a boarder yourself was a much more commonplace aspect of living back in the 1800s. I think it was something like, it's estimated that 1/3 to half of all urban residents had been boarders or housed boarders in their home themselves. So it's not totally unlike the way that we might think of, you know, some Airbnbs these days. And you'll see there's sort of a recurring theme here where the kind of what's old is new again, if you will, and in some good ways. But the US was really kind of rapidly expanding in the 1800s. We went from having 5 million people to 75 million people from the beginning to the end of the 1800s. And so in order to house a population that was like literally doubling constantly, we needed to find ways to house people cheaply and efficiently. And part of that was through boarding houses, but it was also through an array of other different housing types. So this is a picture of the Waldorf and the Astoria, famous apartment hotels. But what I think is really interesting to think about is that throughout the 1800s and early 1900s, there were a lot of various different, there was a much more diversity in terms of housing types. So apartment hotels are a great example of that. These would be buildings where people could have their own private apartments, but also have cleaning services, have a public dining room where people could eat together. And this was also seen as, I think a lot of this kind of lifestyle these days is sort of seen as almost infantilizing, but at the time it was seen as perhaps even having feminist implications, releasing women from the drudgery of household upkeep, and really kind of equalizing the sexes in terms of house maintenance or their access to the city. And so these were big apartment hotels, but certainly there was much more of a kind of array of different housing types from, YMCAs and YWCAs, professional organizations that would buy up buildings and have a building, just for secretaries or just for sailors, or SROs, single room occupancy buildings. This was really kind of the housing stock that had existed for much of that period of the 1800s and early 1900s. But I think that when you talk to people about what that urban living was like, the picture that really is in people's minds is probably something like this. This is a picture from Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. And to be sure, in a lot of cities, there was overcrowding. There were also, poor health conditions in these kinds of situations. It wasn't particularly a dignified way for people to be living. But what happened is that some of the messages around kind of creating housing that was healthier and safer for people got, I think, really conflated with messages of that this kind of living where extended families would be living together, where people would be living with close friends and kind of kin, that was somehow really kind of morally inferior. And the message was really that not only would the suburbs provide you with sort of greener pastures, but that also that would be a better way for you to take care of your family. So even, for example, some of the tenement reforms in this time period, the first thing that was really sort of imagined as a solution to solving improving the tenements was to have every household have its own entrance, its own backyard, and have a private backyard to discourage people from, say, having their kids hang out in the front of the house or in any common areas, even like a stairwell, something like that. And this really starts to take off coincidentally around the time of the last pandemic in 1918. And from then on forward into the 1920s, there was both a sort of government-sponsored and an independent national movement to encourage people to own their own homes, to really move out into the suburbs. And that not only was owning your own home potentially going to be an economic advantage, but that it would really give you sort of a moral advantage. It would make you a better worker, husband, father, citizen, and a real American. And this is really a narrative that we have for 100 years, I think, in many cases, believed that you're somehow inferior if you don't own your own home, and that if you are not sort of at your own unit as a nuclear family or a sort of single person or your own couple in your own household. This idea of your own singular unit has really also really stuck with us. And so given the crowd that this presentation is with, I'm not going to go into the sort of long history here, but certainly from the period of the 1930s, probably I would say up until 2008, was really a period in which the government helped support it to kind of make it so. So really focusing on home ownership as a pathway to financial security, and also as a cornerstone to supporting many of our ideals of what a family could and should be. The problem is that with that sort of home ownership model is that we've learned that many of these various different ways in which we have supported home ownership hasn't necessarily the sort of benefits haven't been evenly distributed. So this is a slide from the Tax Policy Center showing how many of the kind of the incentives to home ownership have really accrued to the wealthiest in our society. And also the types of people who live in the US are very different from, say, the ones who many of these policies were initially created for in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, when the US supported not only things like the GI Bill, but highway infrastructure to encourage suburbanization and single family homes. We're a much more diverse country, and we're also a country where a lot of the sort of social and cultural norms have changed over time. So we're, a country where there's not, certainly not just a single breadwinner who works one job while, say, the mom and wife is at home. We're a country where people are working multiple jobs, freelance jobs. We're a country where, and certainly now remote jobs. We're a country where household types have certainly changed from that kind of nuclear family to one where there's much more multi-generational households. There are many more people who are, a quarter of people are living alone. And yet, surprisingly, much housing has really kind of stayed the same. And so this is kind of where I'm going to pivot from the history into some of the direction of the solutions of how housing is both changing already and how it might further change to address some of the cultural wants and needs of today, and also kind of try to resolve for some of the problems that have been created with single family homes in the past. So this is kind of a little bit of a cheat sheet here in terms of how people are starting to see housing differently as a result of how people are really different than they were, 75 years ago or whatnot. So whereas in the past, people had really prioritized housing that was private, people are increasingly interested in places that have more communal offerings. A culture that has been always focused on things is now gravitating towards a culture much more focused on experiences. And you see that in everything from, social media to the ways in which, a number of people, frankly, are, as they're more sort of nomadic, can't really take on things. They want to actually, focus on experiences rather than objects. Certainly, there's an increasing sector or section of our society that's interested in walking and biking rather than in living in a car-dependent community. And additionally, certainly people have always been focused on things like how housing can support high property values, but increasing number of people are interested in ways in which their housing could be income producing and help them actually address some of the rising housing costs. So I'm not going to go through all of that there, but I will just sort of sum up by saying that as a result of both the social and cultural changes that we've been experiencing, housing has to change, and is starting to go there as well. So there are four solutions that I focus on in the book. And some people have asked me, why did I focus on these four, which doesn't include, for example, say co-housing. And part of the idea is that I wanted to focus on housing solutions that also could be adopted by local governments and sort of help scaled by local governments. And then, that other factor of actually having a housing type that could potentially scale to address housing at large. So the first one that I talk about is co-living, which is a great example of housing that has adapted to the kind of changing wants and needs of people today. So you probably think of, I guess, to just give a description of what co-living is, it is housing where that people have their own private apartments, but also have communal spaces and programming that is really geared towards fostering a sense of intentional community. And this is a photo from We Live, which I think is still around. And actually, I share an anecdote of having spent a little time there in New York as well. But one of the things that We Live has is a bar where they literally have a happy hour every night, which is part of that way of fostering some kind of intentional community. So whereas in the past, having shared housing, the sort of shared spaces might have been the catch to having a roommate or whatnot. In co-living, it's completely part of the value proposition. And so there's a lot of co-living spaces where people have communal meals, they have gym classes together, and it's interesting. I've heard from some co-living developers that that people are increasingly actually they're signing up for co-living leases at the same rates as they were pre-pandemic, and possibly even at higher rates, because a lot of people have spent this past year essentially alone and are looking for ways to actually have a built-in community of people and connect with folks. And it's a kind of housing that really appeals towards people who are moving into cities where they don't know people, and probably are also really focused on not having a ton of space. So, this is an example of the very type of efficient housing that co-living spaces provide, where, your bed folds up into the wall. So it's like for people who just want a little bit of space in a nice neighborhood downtown and are actually wanting to pay more for the experience of the co-living lifestyle than they do the actual space. But I think one of the things that is most interesting here is how this could potentially be applied to a variety of other different types of contexts. So here's an example from New Orleans where a co-living complex got a tax break to keep rent steady. And what's interesting about that is it's taking some of the key ideas of what makes co-living successful for regular market rate tenants, which is that it's a prime location, and providing housing for service industry workers who need to be, close to the tourism center of New Orleans, but perhaps need a little bit less space. And by sort of grouping people, kind of like, again, they did in the past, with those buildings for secretaries and sailors, there could be some advantages for building a sense of community among workers this way. In New York, the city created a Share NYC pilot, which was intentionally focused on housing for people who are exiting homelessness or for people who are low income, and looking at how could you use shared living as a way to both provide some of the wraparound services that might otherwise be sort of not part of a housing situation, but also to get some efficiencies from having more people in a particular building than you would be able to find if it was, single apartments. All right, so that is co-living there. I'm seeing also that there's a couple of things in the chat here, which it keeps on running away here, but I figure I will, should I address any of this stuff now, or should we wait until the end for the chat?
I think we should probably wait until the end because you're kind of cruising on the solutions piece, which I think is key to this. For those of you who do want me to raise something, like go ahead and drop it in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll bring it up. But let's let Diana wrap up her presentation before we jump into the discussion.
Cool. Okay. All right, so that is the co-living solution side of things. The second solution is accessory dwelling units, which also includes tiny homes, which is sort of what's featured here in this picture. But accessory dwelling units have grown in increasing appeal, both among people wanting to actually have an accessory dwelling unit, and also among governments in encouraging them for a bunch of different reasons. Accessory dwelling units work really well to if you want to say, house a loved one. It works really well for multi-generational living. If and an accessory dwelling unit could include everything from a tiny home like this, or an in-law suite, or a basement apartment. And they work really well for things like multi-generational housing, but also as just in general, a potentially affordable housing type. So particularly for things like tiny homes, many people in many cities can't afford more than say 200 square feet. And so by encouraging whether it's homeowners or governments to actually build accessory dwelling units and tiny homes, there's a potential pathway there to creating more affordable housing in a city. And then lastly, doing that in a way in which might be more palatable to a lot of kind of suburban contexts. So instead of building, say, a large affordable housing project, accessory dwelling units can exist in, say, a backyard, and they don't disrupt the sort of neighborhood character of a particular suburban area. And in fact, but at the same time, they could add sort of economic diversity and a bit more density that could support local commercial corridors or transportation. So for all those different reasons, it's something that I think governments and homeowners are keen on. And I think the last one being that a lot of people have looked into them as ways of creating some extra income for their household and a way to keep up with kind of rising housing prices. But I think one of the real challenges here is that in many cases, the folks who are able to build accessory dwelling units are ones who are, sort of already, they already have a certain amount of construction savvy. They already have, certain financial level. And so it's really been challenging for a lot of different cities to figure out, like, how can we actually build this at scale? So one of the examples that I profile in the book is a project in Los Angeles called LA, by a nonprofit called LA Moss, which was really looking to figure out, how they could prototype building accessory dwelling units in backyards in ways that would be accessible to sort of middle income homeowners, and also provide real affordable housing. And so the project that they developed was essentially a one-stop shop technical assistance program where people could get financing, a sort of, a one final cost for building an accessory dwelling unit, working with an approved contractor, and having a sort of streamlined mortgage or financing scheme. And in exchange for all of that technical assistance, the homeowner would agree then to house, to rent to Section 8 tenants. I think it was for a period of 5 or 10 years as part of that program. And this was a really innovative way to try to get to ensure that the housing actually ends up being affordable, because otherwise many people will end up building an accessory dwelling unit and it might end up just being, say, like an Airbnb or something like that. think one of the other things that's also really interesting about accessory dwelling units, which could have, some potential in the years to come, is just the way in which it works really well with technology. So this was from a couple of years ago when, for the first time, people were 3D printing tiny homes. It's become a little bit more popular since then. I can imagine, 10 years from now, this becoming even more feasible. But certainly there are many companies out there that are providing essentially prefabricated backyard cottages as a way to make it easier for people to be able to create this kind of housing. And it's been very interesting to see how once California essentially reformed its zoning to allow accessory dwelling units, which in many cases, many other parts of the country are essentially either not allowed or incredibly difficult to build, they've seen a tremendous uptick going from, a few hundred permits, say, in California statewide to thousands each year. So it's become a very popular thing out in the West. Again, thinking about how could this all apply here on the East Coast. In Philadelphia, for example, there's an increasing focus on tiny homes to house the homeless. And we'll see how that evolves. But after a lot of recent concern over homelessness in the city, they're actually building some tiny home villages within the city limits to house the homeless. But we haven't been able to get accessory dwelling units passed across the city, and it's still a challenge here. The third theme that I look at is—
I'm going to jump in super quick for just like for our DC audiences. DC legalized ADUs in 2016 citywide. And some of the stuff that Diana is talking about, I think is super interesting because the challenge now is to get people to actually like build it and get it like design, permitting, construction is very challenging. The thing that I find super interesting about ADU work is that it sort of turns homeowners into their own little developers. Homeowners are already kind of speculating on their home value increases anyway, right? Like who wants their house to lose value? But it also kind of like turns homeowners into developers. And I think a lot of people who have gone through that process have experienced, how expensive it is to build housing and what the process looks like. And that's something that like, it's hard to get ADUs to scale because we're currently not constructing the housing that we need anyway. And I think it's this funny little relevance to that broader picture of how like what it actually takes to build more housing and the ongoing work that needs to happen even past the legalization of certain structures.
Totally. Right. And that I think is kind of where that example from LA Moss fits in really well, which is just that like I think even after developing that project, I think it was actually really challenging for them to figure out a way to build ADUs at scale and to ensure, that they were rented out affordably. So it's definitely a challenge. All right, 2 more to go, and then we will just do some Q&A here. Sorry, I also didn't keep my watch here, so I don't know how long I've been going for. But the third thing I want to just touch on is multi-generational housing. So this, again, is one of the examples of the ways that people used to live. I think at 1900, the average household had 7 members in it. And we're now at a point where there are something like 20% of Americans live in a multi-generational household. And it's for a number of different demographic trends that are likely to continue into the future. We used to build housing like this, like a Chicago 2-flat, where there were, very just sort of easily constructed multi-generational housing. So where, a family could live on the first floor and maybe the grandparents could live on the top floor. People could easily live have their families living this way with a certain degree of privacy, but also a certain degree of separation. And we're bound to see more multi-generational living now that so many people kind of moved in with their families during the pandemic. The challenge is going to be figuring out how we actually end up building this type of housing. So certainly developers, like this is a floor plan from Lennar, they have caught on to this trend and are now building essentially multi-generational suites, that's sort of what they're calling them, into some of their models, which are kind of like accessory dwelling units already built into the single family home. And I think actually it's kind of exciting because they're a huge developer, and if we actually saw more of this kind of housing being built, it would be better servicing so many of the people who want to live multi-generationally, but frankly can't, because the basic architecture of their homes doesn't really well support the kind of needs that people have, both for that sense of privacy and also connection. I should check what time it is. I don't know how long I'm going, but I'm going to just skip over this example of grand families to speed it up a little bit. I'm going to get to this last section here, which is about healthy living. So the final section of the book is really about kind of rethinking this idea of wellness communities and what that might end up looking like in our cities. So if we sort of, contend that the single family home oriented pattern of development in many of our cities is also leading people to lead less healthy lives, whether it's because they're not getting as much walking and exercise as they would in a kind of more multifamily and mixed use environment, or it's because of a sort of sense of isolation. These kinds of a variety of different types of wellness communities are trying to sort of step into that. So this is an example of a project called Serenbe outside of Atlanta, and it's a very sort of kind of high-end sort of wellness community. And it's one type of vision for this, which it doesn't really look like it, but it's supposed to be a very walkable, not car-centric type of place where people could walk to all of their daily needs, but also have access to, nature trails and a community-supported agriculture. It's basically sort of a utopian idea of taking the suburban model and upgrading it with a focus on health and wellness. But there's also other ways that this could play out in our cities. So increasingly in states like Colorado and New Jersey, hospitals are starting to think about their roles as becoming housing developers, particularly for the homeless, who otherwise would be spending a lot of time in their emergency rooms. And I can imagine 10 years from now seeing much more of that kind of development that is focused on sort of how to extend some of the healthcare and hospital services beyond sort of the four walls of the hospital. Lastly, in Philadelphia, for example, I profile a developer who's providing telehealth services, and this was even pre-pandemic, to tenants as a way to ensure that the tenants are actually healthy, because this actually ends up kind of paying off for them, one, in sort of tenant satisfaction, but two, in that their tenants are then more likely able to keep their jobs and to continue to pay rent and not sort of need eviction. So it could be an interesting way in which developers start to actually think about the health of their tenants or the communities that they're providing housing to as part of the overall package. Okay, so I'm gonna, I figure we're gonna get into some of the discussion about, what does this all mean, and especially for people in the GGWash community, but I'll just sort of leave this here in terms of this question of, how do we get to the housing that we all want? And I think, a big part of that is becoming an advocate for the housing that you actually want to see. And I keep a Google alert on my name, and I came across this letter written to Woodbridge in Connecticut, where there's been a bit of debate over building multifamily housing, as throughout all of the state of Connecticut, a real effort there to kind of break up some of the single family housing. zoning there, and it referenced an op-ed that I wrote, and also the book that I've written as kind of part of the ammo there for both informing his opinion, but also for something that local leaders should be looking at. And so that's sort of the hope of what the book would end up doing, is that it could help inform regular advocates, but also some people who are in the position of changing zoning or approving new housing. And it's a big part, I think, of sort of all of our responsibilities to try to get to the housing that we're looking for. So I will just leave it there and figure this way we have some time to actually have a conversation here. And I'll stop sharing then.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Diana, for such a thorough presentation. You know, I definitely didn't want to like make people read the book to show up to this. So I think it's like having an overview of your work is super valuable. We do have some questions. I have some questions. I'm going to do my best to sort of synthesize what's going on in the chat. You know, Michael, I see that you're putting a lot of stuff out there, and that's super awesome. I think in general, some of these like questions sort of collect into like, how do we actually cut across some of, you know, silos in fields and stuff to start making some of this happen? Maybe you can speak to that.
So sorry, I was just looking at some of these chat questions. So how do we cut across various different silos to make some of this change happen? Is that some of the questions?
Yeah.
So I think that's a good question. So I think the key thing is finding people who are, finding city officials who feel beholden to their constituents, and ensuring that those constituents in turn are also informed about what these different new housing solutions could mean for them. And so I saw that John Geeting from Philadelphia was here, but we're part of a group that is advocating for accessory dwelling units in Philadelphia and working with AARP on that. And one of the challenges is that like a lot of city council members don't really see this as being beneficial to them or to their constituents. Like their constituents are people who have been longtime homeowners. What is this? How's this good for them? And so if you're going to be trying to like kind of convince people who aren't part of the like YIMBY establishment or the group that is already keen on these different ideas, I think it's like you have to start off with this idea of like what's in it for you, and how could you know, potentially changing up zoning or you know, encouraging new housing types actually end up benefiting your, you know, that neighborhood or those constituents.
Yeah, I think that's very true. It's something that we see a lot, you know, through GGWash's work, which is part of the reason why we have a C4 and we endorse people, is that like, you know, we want to make it clear that like there is a constituency for this stuff. It is absolutely never going to be as vocal for people as people who don't want things in their neighborhoods. But it's, I think it's like, there's quite a few people who are like mostly fine with changes in their neighborhoods. And they're not going to engage politically because they have nothing to protect. And that's usually when people jump into the process. So that's definitely true here. Is I have been on many calls this week as we're working on our comprehensive plan to remind council members, staffers, that there's a lot of people who are totally fine with, you know, increases in density and are even willing to withstand 18 months of new construction because they want to see more housing in their neighborhood. But like, they're probably not gonna get like a thank you note that's like, thank you. Like, even though I try to get people to send those, and for everyone on this call, it's super important that you contact your elected officials about this for this reason, because they kind of don't know that you're out there. But you know, that people are not immediately animated by like, wow, this wonderful thing in my neighborhood. They're like motivated by anger, fear, or shame, like, right?
Yeah.
So I think that that's super interesting. There are a few questions about, you know, how does this work for families? This seems like something that only works for singles. I certainly have a whole rant about that and some interesting data on that also, but I want you to go ahead and take that question.
So how do things like, say, I mean, things like co-living, for example, not maybe oriented towards families, sure. But I would say that housing like accessory dwelling units, things like multi-generational living, like that's certainly all about benefiting families. And I think, in a lot of cases, we've heard that like accessory dwelling units are often built so that people they are housing a loved one, someone who they're not charging rent to, and that's another person who's sort of being taken off of kind of the demand side for housing. So I think that those are various different housing types, which are all about kind of like encouraging families to be able to live with different generations or extended family together. Yeah, I'm curious to know what your rant is.
Yeah, so it's funny, you kind of brought this up actually, is that like we kind of see this stuff as infantilizing, and I think immediately jump to like, oh, this is not suitable, this is not possible. And I, in some cases, like I'm not telling people to move their like like 2 parents, 2 kids, grandparent, like into an ADU, like that is like not at all what I am suggesting here. But I do think that like approaching, some of the stuff that's like, this is good for, maybe it doesn't need to be immediately meeting my needs to be good for like the public, or like the sort of like polis, as it were, in that sort of form of discussion, is really key to a lot of the work that I do at GGWash. Housing is so immediate, right? Like when we start thinking about housing, we think immediately about our living situations, our experiences, and that stuff is really valuable. It's really critical, and we should account for that in policymaking. As there are a lot of people out there who are not like me, and I have certain preferences for my housing, but they don't extend across the board necessarily. Like to some degree, this is like very personal public policy, and that makes it a very challenging area to work in. But there's this great paper that came out a couple of years ago from the DC Policy Center called "Taking Stock of the District's Housing Stock." I'll drop it in the Q&A and our follow-up emails. And I think it's very suitable for discussions like this, which find basically that DC actually needs a lot more 1-bedroom apartments, because right now you have group homes or like higher income, couple of white gentrifiers living in like single family housing stock because they can afford it. And so if they can afford that, like why would they afford why would they buy a 2-bedroom condo? So like, for DC people, like you'll see people who could like, maybe they could buy like a 2-bedroom condo in Shaw, but then they'll look at the market and be like, or I can buy this 4-bedroom Wardman in Brightwood or Tacoma Park or whatever. And, they may not be having kids, which is a totally acceptable choice or whatever, but you do have people occupying actually our family size housing stock, which have a considerable amount of, because like there's not an attractive alternative.
Right. I think that's the whole point, right? Like that's the whole point of like the book, which is that like everyone has sort of been shoehorned into single family homes because there's not anything else out there that's better suiting their needs. So I think for a lot of people, they've just sort of made that single family home kind of work for them because that's what's available. But if they were given another option, that in fact might be more attractive to them. And so I think that you might end up finding that certainly being the case with things like, for example, those duplexes, right? So it could be that's a very, very simple way in which to take the single family home sort of size and split it in half, and you get 2 different apartments there, which could lead to like many more different diverse types of households there, rather than just sort of, everyone fitting into that single family home style.
Yeah, and I think about this a decent amount because I'm an only child, and my mom is actually on this webinar. So hi, Mom, thank you for joining. And so as somebody who is in a position to possibly care for their parents as they get older, my parents are in suburban Maryland, and their home is lovely, and I do often think, and we have talked about how sometimes that may not be the best format for all of us. And that's certainly something that I think about a lot. And, it's part of my job to think about that. So, that resonates closely with me also in terms of like, what does the future look like? People's lives are not the same for 30 years. And sometimes they're not even the same for like 2 years. Like some of those temporary housing situations would have been a better fit for me. I lived in San Francisco for not even like 2 years. And like, it might've just been better for me to be in like a functional SRO than to like move between apartment and group house. So I see a lot of myself in that as well.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, the idea of, I just remember talking to Dana Cuff, who is like an architecture professor who had been part of like a policy team advocating for ADU reform in California, and her saying that, like, you know, the story behind almost every ADU is a story of caretaking, whether it is, you know, a parent who's taking care of their sort of adult child, or it's a family taking care of an older parent, or, you know, older parents or whatnot. But in general, we haven't allowed for we haven't thought about that like kind of caretaking role and how that plays into housing, and ways in which we could make it much more affordable for people to actually like take care of their loved ones, if we had more housing options.
Yeah, and the sort of discourse around family-sized housing in DC, I think, has been very limited, right? Because it usually occurs when existing affordable housing projects are redeveloped, and you may lose some of those like 3 and 4 bedroom apartments because they're not as like fiscally attractive to build or whatever. And I think that, you know, that's certainly one thing that we need to keep out for, and we can work on public policy around, which like is like those conversations are occurring, which I think is really valuable. But limiting ourselves to saying like that family size housing is either a 3 to 4 bedroom apartment or a single family home is reductive in its own way, when there may actually be, you know, people may want to be near their families, but may want their own space. They may want their own unit. They may want to be on the same street. Affordability still matters, but not in the same building. Like that, you know, that flexibility, I think is, I think you do a great job of teasing out like why we need to be a little bit more flexible and so, like more imaginative about people's potential housing situations. Jonathan Murphy, I think you've been waiting very patiently with your hand raised. I think you have to unmute yourself and talk if you're able to do that. I'm not sure if I did that correctly or you dropped off. Oh no, I'm sorry. Let me see. Oh, okay, that was an accident. Okay, great. You didn't have your hand raised. Sorry, Jonathan. I think you're gonna get some questions about recommendations for local places to buy the book, but we've got time for, I think, like one more question. And I think this idea, also a question from Michael, you know, how can sort of like small spaces support these bigger hobbies? I think that's actually something that like people react very strongly, like personally to, as well as like, oh, I need a garage to do this, or I need, you know, a backyard to do this.
Right. So like how could you have like an accessory dwelling unit if you're in a housing type that doesn't lend itself to that necessarily, or how might that work in places where there's not as large housing? I mean, I guess the first thing that I would say is, like, there's existing housing stock, and then there's also advocating for this type of housing to be integrated into new housing stock. And so in sometimes when I've been talking about the book, I've had like a whole set of like, how could this play out in various different ways? And like building accessory dwelling units from scratch as part of building a new set of townhouses, or thinking about, you know, sort of like that tiny home sized apartment as part of a building that's going to have multiple different size apartments. I think it's really important to figure out ways to incorporate this stuff into new housing going forward. And unfortunately, I don't see a ton of that happening, like even as this debate continues. As far as like, I mean, some of the housing simply cannot accommodate, say, like multi-generational. I've thought about it a lot in small Philly row homes, and like they're just not meant for it, right? But there's a plenty of stuff where a lot of, you know, your average brownstone, your average row home, whatever, can be turned into a duplex or whatnot with a variance, or you could cut out an accessory dwelling unit into it. It can be done. It's not cheap, it's not scalable, but it's possible.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just, in terms of space, I think there's also a lot of power in the sort of like shared space for hobbies as well. I mean, I am totally like playing to my own stereotype here, but it's not like bike co-ops exist for this reason. Like shared, like there's a lot of like shared wood shop facilities, in part because some of that is like the expense to have some of that equipment in your own home is also considerable, like not just the space, but the equipment for like, this is, I mean, community gardens are like just critical standard at this point in so many places. And like that, as we think about sharing housing, we're actually seeing shared hobbies in some scenarios. That's not true all the time, but so yeah. So I think, that kind of covers our audience questions. It's 1:31. I want to be mindful of time. We did record this. There will be follow-up emails from me. Thank you so much for joining us. Diana, it was lovely to see you. Great to talk to you. I know we started talking about this like last year, and I'm so excited we finally got to do it. And it was honestly a very, really interesting discussion without even talking about the sort of long-term implications of COVID-19. Although I think all of you are great critical thinkers and can sort of apply your own thoughts to the book and to some of the material here about how this might manifest in the future. So thank you, everybody. Talk to you soon. Contact me with any questions. And have a great afternoon. We're at ggwash.org. I'm ABACA at ggwash.org, and talk to you soon. Thanks.
Thanks.
Okay.